Leading a discussion with Marina Walsh on how industries in the housing and real estate ecosystem can achieve social impact through data analytics. As we all know, Desiree is the CEO and president of NAWRB. She's the advisor of Amicus Brain, chairman of NDILC, and CSO of Zulu Time. And Marina Walsh is the vice president of industry analytics, research, and economics at Mortgage Bankers Associations. Please welcome Desiree and Marina to the stage.
So this panel was originally set up to be opportunity zones, social impact, impact investing. And so what we did is we asked Brian to join us up here. As you notice, there's two women and a guy. And it's really going to be about, I guess using a mic could be nice, right? How we can look at the deliverables on what's being done from our communities. And as you see, this is a community that we brought together of the professionals that work in the industry in the housing ecosystem. And when I used to talk about what a house, they'd say, well, housing, that's just about in a home. No, it's about the entire community of where you live, where you work, the technology base, the cable companies, the land, the people who design, the people who work, small businesses, every aspect of it. And hence, that's where we came with the NAWRB report here. And the idea is that if you all take out your book, yes, it's a homework assignment, is we really want you to see the integration of how this came to be. And it came together really about the aspect of what we're going to talk about. Why would an economics person from the Mortgage Bankers Association be up here on finance, on the granular level of how servicing, what the demographics of investing from doing a loan? It's access to capital, to where you live. That is used by real estate developers, which is Brian going to talk a little about, and where he would do an investment and what the long-term returns are going to be. Because we just heard a family office talk about, as Wendy joked, the idea is that in that family office, it doesn't matter if you have 1 0, 50 zeros behind your name, the problems are the same. Emotionally, as you saw them laugh, one rolled their eyes and one just said, no. And we want to really get into that social impact from a holistic level, on the emotional level, and how it really depends. And case in point, real quick, I was in New York City, and I was just recently, and I introduced Tal Ferret. He's from, thank you from Wendy. He's the president of Silverstein Properties, who owns the World Trade Center. And the core is that he bought the World Trade Center 6 weeks before 9/11. Paid $3.2 billion for it, and he's now put over $30 billion into it 18 years later. And when you talk about the most iconic piece of real estate in the world, about the endurance of what it took to really capture the essence of it, keeping 16 acres for the remembrance of what happened, but to deal with all the people who've died during it and continue to die because of the fallout of the chemicals. That is what we're talking about. The social impact of what it's going to be today and where it's going to grow, in addition to helping the greater good from a lot of different angles. So thank you very much for this, and I appreciate for Marina. And Brian, why don't you since we didn't hear about, let's start with you. Give us a little 2-minute overview of your background and what it's like.
Sure. My name is Brian De Lucia. I am come out of the real estate development, land and building development side. Also involved in leading a family office that was built out of originally a land and building development background. And, over the years, that's also included a few other, niche, businesses as well. And on a day-to-day basis, I'm certainly out there, in various different communities, evaluating potential opportunities for land acquisitions. And for our most active business, which is based out of Atlanta, buying and developing residential communities throughout the entire Southeast and Texas, in these communities now that are experiencing large population and job migration, as well as, on the other side, I guess you could say outside of all this, I try to be, I guess a thought leader and I guess you could say a practitioner leader in terms of, just getting into communities and talking a lot about, leadership aspects of, whether or not you're, in real estate, developing better places to live and work, as well as just traditional industries in terms of the, the jobs and the economics that, we could grow in communities by elevating companies to more, meaningful levels.
Great. So if we were to ask you a question for home affordability, obviously, all-time low, impact of what we have to look at for the rising rents, and we continue to have migrations of making sure that there's a place, but it still has to pencil out. What are you doing from a real estate development side that when you go into a community, I want to better define the hospitality side to bring in workforce? I want to define the idea of how do we have small businesses involved? How do we make sure that we don't have the death of a community? If we were to not name out names, Walmart, that went into a community that, a rural community, and opened up shop, and 3 years later shut down, and it removed all the small businesses because they couldn't compete. So everyone went to work for Walmart. As soon as they closed the doors and said it wasn't profitable, that city literally died. So how do we, with the social impact and the development of a community, obviously rural communities are high risk, but also high reward. Look at, the U.S. Virgin Islands. That is an established community, but they want you to come back, and he literally did a phenomenal job of saying, look at the lure to come. As an impact investing, what are the dynamics around that?
From a workforce housing
Yes.
perspective? Well, I think the most importantly is, as you mentioned, you have to make the numbers work, and that's on the workforce housing side is probably from a ground up development aspect is the most challenging. However, what we do, I think, and how we address it, and right now we certainly do a lot of, market rate housing, and this is applicable, certainly to workforce housing, in which, we'll make a full transition to that as soon as we kind of burn off this current cycle, due to, as you said, there's, substantial needs, but from an economic standpoint, it's controlling the budget. I think the biggest mistake that a lot of real estate developers make is they're playing the short game ultimately. They're trying to squeeze every penny they can out of their own projects, and they outsource everything. So they're outsourcing the engineering. They're bringing in many of them a separate general contractor, and then they're also kind of artificially hiding money or adding money within the budget, so their investors, ultimately aren't, taking notice of this. They're kind of overlooking that when they're evaluating, these opportunities. So the problem then becomes is for the investors that have the largest amounts of capital to deploy, ultimately these projects aren't producing compelling enough economics. So as a result, they're only identifying, what we call, I guess, the friends and family retail type investors, which certainly slows down the development. So on our end, what we do a little bit differently is we actually control our own budget. So number one, when we acquire land all cash. We don't have to, go out and raise capital or identify debt for the land. So the land is owned free and clear, which helps, also on the back end, that if we have any type of, recession, we're not sitting on non-income producing land that we're paying debt service on. But then also, secondly, these days we're buying the land where it's zoned and entitled to, build, but you still have to go in and finish up the engineering, and we actually do our own engineering. So from a budget perspective, if let's just pretend the normal budget would be $2 million for engineering, our cost would be $1 million. That's a substantial difference in terms of costs there. And then we actually oversee our own general contracting, which takes, again, a substantial amount off the cost basis, and then also not hiding, money into the budget. So as a result, we're controlling a budget, which reduces a lot of risk, which creates in a normal market, very, very large or wide, margins because the cost basis is so low. So in a traditional or normal market environment, you have venture capital-like economics on these projects. And then on the other side of it, when we do have, let's just say another 2007, 2008 happen, which is certainly possible. We're in a position that we have such wide margins that we could absorb all that, and on our existing communities, we could even drop rents in half and still absorb that. And I would venture to say it's very few, if any, other developers that can make that statement. So I think that's a really, really important thing from a developer's perspective is summarizing a little bit of my diatribe for a moment is, controlling your budget, playing the long game, and making these transactions favorable enough to attract the, strong, I guess you could say the strong capital that's in the marketplace compared to the, more the patchworking, the retail investors. So it creates a lot more velocity.
Oh, thank you. One thing real quick, get on Marina, is that, the World Trade Center, could you imagine building a floor a day and keeping it on budget? Mm-hmm. They did that. There's 5 of them. They have 1 left to go. That is controlling. So, Marina, here you are. You get up on stage at MBA, a lot of your conferences all over the United States on multiple years. How long have you been at MBA now? 18 long years.
Almost 19. October. Yeah.
She's counting the days. Heard you speak many times. Phenomenal. And the resources that you have helped us with the NAWRB report to connect to various different sources. Let's talk about, you have a presentation up here, and let's talk about your granular side. When I asked her to speak on it, she's like, I don't know anything about opportunity zones. I don't, I'm this, person that does the analytics on this end of mortgage and finance. How does that relate? The idea is that we don't go all the way down into the levels that are deep enough sometimes, I feel, from a developer standpoint. If we only knew, we'd be able to touch. And I'm going to call out my daughter-in-law, Laura Roberts. She's like, okay, great, thank you, stand up, Laura. She works for Pacific Life. She's an actuary. And I asked her for the property casualties on what it would be like to be included in the NAWRB report. So thank you, Laura, for being here. 10 years working there. And the idea is that, the connection, why? What is about the fact that you have the idea of where we're going to invest for the climate control? You heard Kamal talk about, they had 2 Hurricane 5s in 2017, I believe I heard. That's huge. And take that back to the World Trade Center. Do you realize the building has 14,000 pounds per inch? And the Hoover Dam is only 7,000 pounds per inch of the cement? So, get back to Marina
that's a great transition, Desiree, because that's great transition. I started my career way back when in the early 1990s with an interview. This was after the first bombing. Who remembers the first? the PATH bombing in the early 90s in New York. And I had my first interview in, it looked like a warehouse because everybody was displaced after that. And then I went on to work at the World Trade Center for many years in the early 90s. Yes, very nice, when I was in New York. So that brings back happy memories, and where I met my husband, too. So.
See, this is
Yeah,
community.
that was the purpose of bringing up the World Trade Center. But I can't talk about the World Trade Center. I can talk about a lot of the issues that Dr. Crow was bringing up. What is the state of the overall economy now? Where do things look in terms of housing affordability from both the supply side and the demand side? At MBA, I've been there 18 years, just to give a little bit more background for those who weren't listening. As you were sitting down, as you were getting your third cup of coffee, I've been with Mortgage Bankers Association a long time, and before that I was with Ernst & Young. And what I really focus on is actually profitability of mortgage companies, working with the CEOs and CFOs of mortgage companies, community banks, credit unions, independent mortgage companies, on how they can be more profitable and what their numbers look like versus other peers. And so that's what I focus on. But at the same time, we have a whole research and economics group, our chief economist, Mike Fratantoni, and Joel Kahn are our two economists that you might see. They're on social media a lot and do their little Twitter feeds, et cetera. Focus on what the housing market is going to look like. So obviously this is of concern to the folks that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. If you own a mortgage company, what's happening? Is there going to be consolidation? Is there going to be mergers and acquisitions? And also the CFO. So it comes back to the basics of, is there demand for housing? And if there's demand for housing, are there demands for mortgage originations? And what does that mean in terms of the bottom line profitability? So I actually think of myself as more of a business consultant than an economist per se. But a lot of these slides that we have here focus on the overall economics. Now there's one, that's what I was waiting for. Okay, on command, yeah. So we're going to focus on demand, but I want to go back to something that Brian said, because I kind of disagree. He said, well, we could easily have a 2007 and 2008 situation again. Well, if we do, we may have a recession. That was a great recession, okay? That was pretty bad. And I truly believe, and the other economists at MBA believe, that it won't be housing. It won't be the housing market taking us into that recession like it was in 2007, 2008. I mean, really, we're, that industry. The industry has actually been pretty weak. After all the refinancings in 2012 and 2013, we've really had a hard time going back to supply. Well, we're at demand right now. But when we get to supply, there's a huge supply issue. And so in terms of housing in relation to GDP, housing has been quite weak. In fact, last year was the worst year in terms of profitability for mortgage companies overall. So it's not as if I think, we're not seeing credit standards changing too radically.
Well, no, when I was referring to earlier about a reset, I wasn't referring to the housing. I was kind of playing off of our conversation last night with, some of the other things with, credit card debt, student debt, and corporate debt. That's at some dangerous levels right now. That I think
it is dangerous.
Which certainly impacts other people's, affordability.
True. Although, you look at the overall financial obligation ratios from the Federal Reserve, you look at the debt service ratios, still where we are now versus 10 years ago, huge drop off. So financial obligation ratios, it could be better, especially among young people. What's happening is folks just aren't buying homes. They're not taking on certain types of debt that they used to take on, I think, to some extent.
You got the 7 million we were talking about last night, so you can get in our eavesdropping, is I made a comment that there's 7 million car owners that are behind 90 days or more in their payments. That's more than the homes. That's huge. Credit card debt. is huge.
I know
I don't have the
delinquency,
statistic off the top of my
yeah.
head.
I know,
Yeah,
just
the
like
delinquency rates.
yeah,
are up.
just like in like the Austin, Texas market, which is economically a very strong market right now, but they've had a substantial increase just in the past year in credit, personal credit card delinquencies.
Yeah. I think it was 6 years ago, the personal savings rate was at about 12%, and we're at about 6% now. But if you look at it historically, 6% is still it's about average. So yeah, there are those. Again, I think it's a matter of looking at different segments. But if you look at sort of nationally overall, the financial obligation ratios, it's not. We're not in a crisis situation, I don't think. But we can agree to disagree on that.
I
How
like
about
this
that?
idea.
Okay,
Well, he's a
okay.
guy, you're a girl, we'll take it out of that.
I'm being much more optimistic, right? The sky's not falling yet. But anyway, I was just going to show some slides. Dr. Crow started talking about this too. What's going on with the economy? We're getting such mixed signals right now. There's great information here on job growth and the unemployment rate being at 50-year lows. And we just had the jobs numbers that came out last week, and they were pretty positive for July. Not bad at all. I think we're at an 163,000 job growth clip per month in 2019. So, not too bad. Unemployment is, at 3.7%. So what's up? What is going on? Why do we need this interest rate reduction? When we have this kind of pretty picture. And there are a few things that we can turn to, and Brian, you can name a few too, but we do have an inverted yield curve, and that 25 basis point drop did nothing to change that, so we have an inverted yield curve. Stock market was doing really well, but when you think about the end of 2018 to now, it's been quite volatile, so a lot of volatility, slowing in terms of overall economic growth, global economic growth. Dr. Crow mentioned the trade tensions already. And then you have inflation, the magical 2% in inflation, which is what everybody seems to want to see to indicate things are healthy. We've never hit that 2% inflation rate yet. And so those are all cause for concern. I'm not sure whether it's up to debate about the 25 basis point drop. I will say that in the mortgage world, which is what I track, it did not do much to change weekly applications. In fact, our weekly mortgage applications have been down over the last 3-4 weeks, up on a year-over-year basis in terms of purchases, but still, not this huge refi boomlet. I think we still have folks in sort of their mortgage interest rate is, hovering between 3.75 and 4.25, so they need a bigger drop in rates to refinance. And then we have all sorts of purchase issues that I know we're going to talk about in regard to no inventory. There is no housing to buy. The inventory is not keeping up with population and household growth, which leads to more of the slides. Wage growth, kind of going up a little bit, going up a little bit, especially in the last 2 years. These are 3 different indices that most economists look at in terms of overall wage growth. So we are seeing this increase in wage growth, which is good, but at the same time, home price appreciation is going up at a much faster clip versus wage growth. So we have that, and then other demand changes right after the recession for about, I'd say about 8 years or longer than 8 years, 8 to 10 years. It was a renter household, increases in renter-occupied households. Now we see this switch where it's moving toward owner occupancy. So we had this huge rental market, this huge demand for multifamily properties, condos, et cetera, or not necessarily condos, multifamily rentals. And now we're moving more toward a potential demand for condos And just with household formation, and especially with millennials getting a little older, into their 30s, which means that they might be having kids, we see a little bit of an increase in that owner occupancy overall. So, definitely a change for a long period of time. We just, right after the recession, who was going to buy a home? The home ownership rate just plummeted. And now we're seeing these incremental increases, and it's increases among very specific groups. Hispanic households, for example, huge, pretty significant increase in home ownership among Hispanic households. Millennials, with the baby boomers, they're kind of staying put, so they have different needs, but there could be need for home equity, origination home equity loans to remodel, refinance. So, the big demands of where I see as we move a little bit more toward owner occupancy is remodels, and I think needs of sort of the younger generations and the older Generation X sort of slips in there, I think, but among the millennials and the aging baby boomers. Okay, so that's what we see. Here's a change, and this gets to housing demand. Where is the demand coming from? We did this study a few years ago that looks at the next 10 years and where is the household formation going to be? And it really is among these aging baby boomers at about 12 million. And then the folks that are 25 to 28 years old moving into their 30s, that millennial generation, 5 million increase. But overall, household formation is averaging, I think, about 1.2 million households per year is the clip that we're seeing. FYI, for those that like tracking housing, Harvard's joint housing, the Housing Institute, they just came out with their 2019 report. You can download it from their website. It has a lot of great statistics on women households, Hispanic households. It's a really good resource talking about demographics, home ownership, rental households versus occupied households. So I encourage you to download that if you're interested in this information. There we go. So there's been improvement. There is household formation. Before, 4 years ago or 5 years ago, I would have been talking about all the kids living in their parents' basement. So at least they're moving out of their parents' basement. It's true, they're moving. So that's a good thing because of the wage growth. But it's also a question of, is there low to moderate income, is there that housing stock for the first-time homeowner available out there? Any other? That's good? Okay. I think I have one more on demand, which just is the potential for growth. You see this drop in home ownership by age, and this is just looking at the younger populations that we've heard so much about. I hate saying younger because I'm not in this group anymore. It's really, Anyway.
No opinions here.
We need to have a conference on aging. We do have that. That's the panel next. Great. Okay.
How about a whole conference on the aging population?
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Okay. So, there's tremendous growth, and it's just a matter of providing the housing they want. They're, going back to some of the items that Brian was talking about, what they want is not necessarily what my generation wanted. Space is not a premium. Having the McMansion is not necessarily the premium. They're willing to stuff their kids in condos and to have the convenience of being close in, but then there are other issues that come around with that change, which is how's the educational system. And so, there are all sorts of community challenges with that change. And do we get to a point where those millennials who love the urban lifestyle, who needed less space, end up moving primarily, I think, because of education, the educational opportunities.
Well, you have overcrowding of schools. The idea is that, and then teachers come and go, and infrastructure for the support of the schools.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay, so that was the major demand. So what do we see in terms of supply? Okay, so this looks at the number of units completed. We have a problem, and you've probably heard about the 3 L's: land, labor, lumber. There's no land. It's really tough, and I'm sure, Brian, you can talk about this, to get permits. You said you buy the land with the permits already? Yeah. Okay. Well, permitting is a process, and the places that need it the most, permitting is the most arduous in those places that need the housing the most. So you have the land problem. You have the labor problem, where there's just not enough construction workers to do the work. Very tough. I was talking to my sister-in-law who lives in Northern California, and she can't get folks, especially after Santa Rosa with everything happening with those wildfires and all the rebuilding involved in that. She can't get anybody to work on basic, improvements to her house. It's really tough. So parts of the country, and especially with these natural disasters too, you flock to where you're going to get the best wage. And with the natural disasters, you have a lot of those folks, the drywall folks, the plumbers, the roofers, et cetera, going to those areas. And so there's a huge need. There's a huge need for construction workers right now. So there's the land, there's the labor. Supplies, our wonderful tariffs, Canadian lumber, steel, the various supplies that go into building a house. It's just become very expensive. And as a result, when you think about developers, am I really interested as a developer to build a low to middle income housing development? Does that make financial sense? Does that make financial sense when you have to pay more for the land, the labor, and the lumber and everything? And so there's that disconnect, making it financially feasible.
I'm good. Excellent point. So I'm going to, with that, call out to the audience. I would like U.S. Virgin Islands to answer the question to basically what you're saying. If you take the 3 L's, labor and lumber, how are you addressing that? Obviously, you're getting the business to come there and give them this incredible, life is too perfect, at 90% tax reduction and everything else you're doing out there. How does that fit into the equation of getting the supplies? I mean, we've got Yolanda from Puerto Rico coming over to the U.S. Virgin Islands. How does that play into that, if you don't mind answering?
In terms of land, we have a lot of land in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
You only have 219 miles. That's not that much, but okay.
There are no environmental issues.
You can build in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Come and build. We do have, as in a lot of places, labor dynamics. Since we are recovering from the hurricanes, there are a lot of people who have come to the Virgin Islands because the amount that you can earn, $50 an hour in some instances, because of the recovery work. And so we have a lot of recovery workers there and a lot of people who are electricians and welders, what have you, who are there in the territory. On the lumber side, I have not heard anything in terms of challenges with the availability of lumber, so I do not know if that is or isn't.
And lumber, we just mean supplies. It's just cute, the 3 L's, but all supplies. Yeah.
As long as the ships are sailing, the supplies are flowing. And so that's not a dynamic unless there is a severe weather event like the hurricanes where it shut shipping lines down for a while. Okay,
great. So I'm going to Dr. Alexis Crow. You were recently, if I'm not mistaken, on one of the major networks about the China and U.S. tariffs. Now they're coming back. They're projecting they're going to come back and increase them, and all the craziness that's going on with that. Obviously, that affects supply in a big way. How does that interact? And also, it affects education. It affects their buying power. That is a huge factor in the ecosystem as far as the community social impact that we're talking about here. What do you know in your crystal cards that you think that you see that's coming down the pipeline that could be a little different, how you see that being addressed, being that you're on the global expert on that?
Thank you so much. I think probably going back to the beginning of why this volatility is in the markets, is again kind of going back to the roots of this decline of the purchasing power, right? So that enables people to try and vote for change, and that appeals directly to populism and nationalist politics. That has direct implications, I think, both on the amount of capital coming into the United States. So we've seen house prices, obviously in California, slipping when we had capital controls imposed in China. So less Chinese families coming in with money here. I've met with a number of the family offices who represent them here in Newport Beach. And so you will see an impact on price. We've seen that in New York, where prices have really significantly come down as a result of Chinese capital being zapped. The corollary of that is that we've seen prices, of course, come up in Canada. So Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal now even, but Vancouver being absolute number worst in terms of affordability, and the mortgage debt there, I think, is a risk on the global dashboard. The other thing in terms of supply, as you mentioned, Canada, like everyone has this focus on US and China, but very infrequently do we look at the impacts and the downside impacts on not only industries, but then in other countries around the world. And so little do we know that the cost of printing newspapers in the United States is skyrocketed because the number one source of pulp comes from Canada. Yeah. So I'm hearing the same thing about materials as well. The other side of this is an anti-immigration, so not only anti-foreign capital, but anti-immigration policy. And one of my sovereign real estate investor clients, the largest real estate investor in the world, is they're like, we can't find staff. They're trying to move staff from Seattle to Las Vegas. There's a shortage in Las Vegas. And so that's the other huge question mark that I have, not only for our economy, but also for the UK, where I spent a lot of my adult life, is if you don't have a positive immigration policy, who is going to be able to contribute to the industry? So these, I think, are some of the longer term issues that we're facing today that are going unnoticed by a lot of the animal spirits, and that are also going unnoticed by just watching the stock market.
Isn't that phenomenal? Thank you.
Yes.
You know, you think about Canada, you know, I think it was in Toronto I saw, or it was $2 million for a total shack that was a teardown, you know, that you're buying when it could have been bought, you know, for $500,000 just a few years ago. The migration has been just so huge. But the idea is that building supplies, I mean, when you talk about printing, and to flip from that, you talk Canada brought in, is the cost of printing all the material you see in hard copy. How many times you now see how many newspapers and magazines and things that are no longer available in print because of those hard costs that are going to, everyone's doing digital days and things like that. So when we talk about social impact and we talk about the development of the community, how many, seeing that newspaper sitting on the ground, you know, we have recycling and we have, you know, so when we talk about, yeah, I'm talking about names that I'm just dropping, but the purpose is to get you to think in a very global and a very connective, that everything we do and touch has a consequence, right? And a choice to go with it. So with that, I just wanted to highlight the ideas is that when we're talking about those units, can be really effective. But go ahead.
So here's another good one. I love data, can't you tell? Ooh, I have more. I have 50 more slides for you.
No.
Okay, so this is looking at vacancy rates, whether it's a rental or owner-occupied. The vacancy rates are at all-time lows. Again, we're not keeping up with household formation right now. That's a big, big problem. And so, you know, you see these vacancy rates that keep going down. You know, we hope for some reprieve. There's some reprieve in terms of house price overall, but at the same time, there needs to be more supply in to, you know, to resolve this issue, which is why, you know, that we have the opportunity zones. I guess that was put into effect in the Tax Cuts Act of 2017, at the end of 2017. And there are other initiatives in place in Congress to try to address the issue with supply or rehabbing properties. There's a new legislation in the House for, housing revitalization. And that's why it's so important, because you see these vacancy rates that continue to grow. Here are the issues I mentioned before on why there is not more home building. We kind of just talked about that, and we had Virgin Islands as an example there. But, in certain parts of the country, the issues are acute. Washington State, California, Oregon. Right now, California, there was this great study on construction and where the construction is taking place. Colorado, which is going through a huge population, growth right now. Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, that whole area is just booming right now. And so there's a lot of construction taking place there, but we have these needs in the Northeast, we have needs in the district, different parts of the country that are not being met yet. And then this just ties it together. This ties the supply and the demand together, looking at wages versus home price growth. And, you hear the folks, for instance, in New Jersey, some folks have their, McMansions in New Jersey, and they talk about, what do you mean there is no home price appreciation? Well, again, you're talking about one sector. It's at the upper ends. I think it's in the next chart, actually, where we talk about home prices. Yeah, they're decelerating somewhat, but here is the interesting thing. It's the high-end properties where you see the most deceleration in home price appreciation. And that's important to understand. We're talking about deceleration in home price appreciation. In certain pockets of the country, you might actually see values going down, but in general, it's just a slowing in terms of home price appreciation. That's an important concept there. But unfortunately, not necessarily for the low to moderate income borrower, which is where the housing supply is really needed. It's on the high-end properties. And this particular slide looks at home price appreciation versus different buckets. This was done through the Urban Institute, looking at different tiers of buyers, sort of the low-end tier buyer versus the higher-end tier versus wage growth. And so, the biggest change, again, is with that higher tier versus the lower tier. That really sort of encapsulates the challenge we have as a country right now.
I'd like to address real quick the climate aspect of it. And there's an article that just came out this morning, literally 2 hours ago, about globally. And I want to get a couple aspects about it. I thought it would be fabulous today. The idea is that here's how the hottest month in recorded history unfolded around the globe. In the Netherlands and the officials in Switzerland, that it got up to 108.5 degrees in Paris, 101.7 degrees in England. It was the hottest recorded month in Alaska. Raging fires through I believe it was Alaska. The idea is that imagine how these natural disasters are dropping and changing. In Alaska, I remember back in the early 70s, I was up there, and the idea of going to Portage Glacier and seeing the blue water, 10 miles now gone. Having Cook's Inlet, the water come and go and flow with salmon running. Hundreds of millions dying of fish because of the global changing that's going on. So when Kamal was talking about the natural disaster impact, we can talk very granular like Marina's doing here. But the idea is that when I want to bring it back into Brian, when we're, and Dr. Alexis Crow, when we're dealing with how do we invest, how do we look at, how do we market, not only from a very high-level aspect, but from us as individuals. Where do we own our home? I was talking to Cynthia last night. We asked her where home base was. well, it could be here, it could be here. We're debating, we're talking about, right now we're talking between husband and I, we'll determine. We're like, okay, great, we can be part of the conversation, right? Love it, right? Very there. But the idea is that these are very real, very to us, and not just from a business perspective, that we have to take into more perspective. Hence why I brought up Laura's at Pacific Life is that as an actuary, predicting where, what, how, what's this going to look like? And we can't think of, can I qualify? Is it going to be good for me? What's going to look for the school districts? For our business, where we go? We've got to start looking at the analytics and what it's going to do. And then sometimes, as we heard earlier yesterday, sometimes it's gut. And we just go with our gut feel versus then all the numbers. And we heard Cynthia say sometimes you don't live by the numbers, which I love. Because to walk and know the numbers sometimes, it gets in your head saying my success rate's based on my numbers. And you have to remove that. And at our age, we just say, we don't care anymore. You know, you love them, you hate it, I don't care. It works. So I want to bring that back to Brian real quick, if I don't mind, Marina, is we're out of time, is when you look to buy and invest from a dig point, you already buying property pre-permitted. And that's such a big deal because when, back to the World Trade Center, 19 governments and 5 governors had the audacity to tell how to spend his billions of dollars, and he wanted them to redo it because they didn't like the way he was doing it. That impact, when you brought up about permits, could be such a defer on building that real estate. How is that impacting you when you're going to predict whether or project the numbers when you're buying real estate land from an aspect of weather, an aspect of permits and government oversight, not just getting the permits, but continue?
Well, I think, one of the things, just bouncing off your, observation a few minutes ago with actuaries and historical and everything. I think like historical numbers almost, moving forward in a lot of areas are, kind of going a little bit by the wayside in some ways. There's so many things that are rapidly changing in the world right now that is very scary, where you're seeing, like with the climate change, there's no denying something's going on out there. And over the last just 2 or 3 years now, we're seeing more frequent, severe and traumatic weather events, whether they're, we had, 3 major hurricanes within 1 month touching U.S. soil. I mean, that's unfathomable. And then, you're just seeing just a few weeks ago, the massive number of tornadoes that were happening, and some of them in locations, flooding. And some of them in locations that very rarely have a tornado. So there's a lot of these things. It's just like in the economics, like investors historically always found like the bond market's very safe. And I think that's being thrown out the window, as we're kind of looking ahead a little bit. But I guess answer your question, from one of the things that we have is we get access to like very proprietary levels of data. So like from our perspective, we try to eliminate, speculation as much as possible. So like when we're developing real estate or picking locations, and, like I said earlier, controlling the budget is certainly very important, but the next level of importance is site selection. And we tend to, look at areas, not infill, but like right on the perimeter of where current development activity is going on, and we get proprietary data that we could see exactly in this neighborhood what are rents today, is specifically rents per square foot, what are absorption rates today in this neighborhood, what are other developments that are coming online. So we know exactly what we're walking into. Unlike a lot of developers, they may be buying something 2 miles down the road and saying, well, it's coming here next. And I'm sure everybody's been in real estate, and they probably have heard that line quite a bit over the last 20 years. It's coming here next. And, but you don't know. I mean, like just, 15 years ago, everybody was throwing these numbers out like in the mortgage industry. Like there are this many mortgages being written now. There's this many refinances being done. In 2010, there's going to be this many. But nobody realized there's something nobody thought about 2007, 2008 happening. So all that speculation got thrown right out the window. And so you just can't, guess and saying, well, it's coming here next.
On that note, I don't know who's worse, economists or whether women and men, because between the two, I mean, I'm looking at our forecasts from last year in terms of interest rates. What economist, other than maybe Dr. Crow, was predicting where interest rates were going to be? Our estimate for where interest rates were going to be today was 110 basis points different from where we are, 110 basis points. So, we're talking folks who've been in the industry a long time. And
they only monitor 8,000 bills in D.C. So you think they might have that together a little bit?
110 basis points. That's, it's hard. It's hard to predict the future. Going back to the whole natural disasters, what the financial conditions are. It's very, very tough to predict the future. That's for sure. But I think understanding, which I think you were getting at a little bit, understanding your local markets is really key.
So thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next panel. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.